Now we'll start looking at coastal areas. Very important. This is where people tend to interact most with the ocean, like what can be seen in the background of my background here. So let's get the PowerPoint going here. Coastal areas are very dynamic. There's lots going on. We've got the weather, we've got waves, tide, all of these coming together, and they tend to be constantly changing places. A lot of this is due to the waves. As the waves are breaking, they're taking the energy of that wave that traveled sometimes long distances across the ocean, and it's hitting the shore and often moving things around. Again, waves coming to shallow water, the speed, the celerity gets lower, the length shortens, the height increases, if my hands don't disappear here, and also we tend to get waves bending, refracting. As they come in, again, waves in somewhat deeper water where the shore is further from where the wave's coming from, that part will tend to keep on moving faster. Wave hitting shallower areas slows down. So the faster moving part is going to swing around and the wave ends up coming in nearly parallel to the shore. As the height goes up and the length decreases, eventually it's going to become unstable. Again, water is not a great thing to make a hill out of. So it will tend to break. And this also leads to distinctive current patterns, longshore currents and rip currents. Again, more of the wave changes. We looked at these not too long ago, just a reminder. And different shores get different styles of breaking waves and associate different patterns of energy. Again, our spilling breakers, a lot of that energy of the wave is getting lost as the water tumbles down the front. By the time it gets all the way to the beach, that's not too hard on the beach, that coming in. Plunging breaker, somewhat more energy there. Surging breaker, hardly any of the wave energy has been lost before it's crashing into the shore there. And again, diagram version of that wave bending, where it's going more slowly, the waves tend to bend in, which is the shallow water areas where land sticks out. Longshore currents, as the name suggests, go parallel to the shore. And as they do so, they will move things along the beach, whether it's sand or you, if you're in the water. You may have noticed sometimes you go to the beach and, oh, here's a nice spot for my towel. So you toss it down and head out into the water, and you're out there splashing around a while, back to the beach, and hey, who moved my towel? It's over there now. Well, actually, nobody moved the towel. You moved out in the water due to a longshore current. Picture here, you can see waves coming in. The ones further out are at more of an angle relative to the beach, but right as you get close to the beach, those waves are becoming much closer to parallel. They're bending in, and for that wave to be bending, that's sending some water sideways. That's what's setting up our current. We see things moving along. The swash zone up here is where alternately we have waves coming onto the beach, washing back again, in and out, back and forth. Surf zone is just out from the swash zone. It's where we have water there basically all the time, but the waves are breaking in the surf zone. And that's where most of the wave energy is being released and affecting the shore. And again, as we set up currents there, we have longshore drift. There's also beach drift. Waves go up onto the beach, well, whatever direction wave is coming. But if that wave comes in at something of an angle, it drains basically straight down the beach. So waves coming in at a bit of an angle will tend to sand sideways along as each wave washes up. Also, there's a little bit of that just as a big wave comes up, you get some draining to the side. Again, that'll move some sand sideways in that area. There's the swashbuckle for the swash zone. There's what I just talked about wave direction, washes up, draining back, and that tends to move the sand a little bit sideways each time. Again, as waves are coming in, if they're not perfectly straight on to the beach, but if you can see how well the camera shows, if they're at an angle, well, as it comes in, the wave's going to kind of swing around and not magically disappear. Camera's not helping too much with the zoom background stuff, but anyway, we see a current being generated, and not surprisingly, if that wave is coming in at a bigger angle, it's further from directly straight onto the beach, then yeah, it takes more to swing that around, so you get a bigger current. Also, no surprise, bigger wave, that'll give us bigger currents as well. Also, as we go along a wave, it's almost never perfectly the same all the way across. We have higher and lower spots. Where a wave washes up higher, then we get water draining sideways towards places where the wave wasn't so high. So there's some longshore flow that's going to happen even if our wave were perfectly straight on relative to the beach. Here's an example of this. You see where a bigger wave has come up and some water draining off to either side. Making currents that go sideways along the beach. Well, if two are coming at each other, water has to go somewhere. And so you will set at a narrow rip current going out to see where those two longshore currents run into each other. Rip current, rip tide, it's not an accurate name, it's not a tide. But it's a relatively narrow and fast flow. Also, a method does not pull you under, it just carries things out. But out in the ocean is not really where you want to end up. So this is a problem. Okay, how do you escape from it? Well, if you try to swim straight back against it, the current's going faster than you can swim. So you're just going to get tired out that way. That's not very helpful. But it's narrow. So if you swim sideways and then you can head back into shore when you're not being carried by the current. Also, just kind of floating. And another important thing is to wave around and get attention of folks on the beach that you need help. I did see one suggestion that you can try waving your swimsuit around, but that might get you too much attention. There's a video that you can click on from NOAA, National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, that will talk more about riptide, kind of, again, emphasize safety, go sideways, or just float and get attention as a safety approach. Again, rip currents, so if we've got two longshore currents that are running into each other, now, typically, waves are coming in from a standard direction. Yeah, weather changes. Sometimes you'll get waves from different places, but most commonly for any one beach, there's a standard direction. And so you've got a standard longshore current primarily going in one direction. Okay, the longshore current's basically going that way most all the time. That doesn't give you a rip current. When is it a problem? Well, again, if we've got big waves washing up, those with the sideways draining for them are much better at setting up rip currents. So when there are bigger waves, that tends to be a more dangerous time for rip currents. There are alerts given saying, watch out for rip currents under certain conditions. Storms, and again, waves can travel long distance across the ocean. This year, we've had a number of hurricanes and other types of tropical cyclonic systems that were way out in the middle of the ocean and not directly affecting land, but they're generating big waves. And those waves then travel across and can lead to dangerous conditions for rip currents on our coast, even if the storm is nowhere near. Of course, if the storm is near our coast, then we have risk there as well. Again, waves, different heights, that can give us longshore currents as well. Longshore currents run into each other. That gives us the rip current. So looking at the picture again, wave is coming up over here and also another one over here. We've got currents going sideways from both of them, producing a rip current. You may notice also in the rip currents here, the water is noticeably more muddy from the fast current stirring up the sand, probably mostly sand rather than mud actually on the beach there. Also, something you may notice, we see the line of surface waves come in, and then where are the lines of surf and breaking waves? They're not in the rip current. That gap in the waves, because the rip current is pushing the other way, that's another clue to the existence of a rip current. Okay, so we've got longshore currents. These tend to move stuff sideways. And over time, that can be significant. Say if we have an island like this, and longshore drift is going here from left to right, which of these two is a better long-term place for a beach house? Now, how's the sand moving? And the whole island's basically a big pile of sand. Now, I'm sure there's some mud buried in there as well, but at any rate, that's pretty easy to move by the ocean for the most part. So over time, this house there at the left end of the island is going to end up as a timeshare air property. You get it at low tide and the fish get it at high tide. What a deal. And so over time, beaches, islands can to some degree be moving around. And then we humans like to put up stuff that we think is going to be permanent, which doesn't work so well on moving substrates. So, thinking more about beaches. Area of the land touching the ocean. We can recognize offshore zone out deeper than where the waves are breaking. Near shore is the zone where we have waves that are breaking. The back shore, that's the part that we normally think of when we talk about beach, the actual land next to where the waves are reaching the shore. And of course, this is changing all the time. Tides go in and out, storms. Of course, lunar cycle gives us our spring versus neap tides. Different seasons have different conditions. Around here, for example, we tend to have more storms either in the winter or in the later summer to fall. But different places have different patterns with the seasons. So all these zones are going to be moving back and forth, tide, storms, all the things going on. Diagram version, we have the offshore out here where the waves are not yet breaking. And then a near shore zone with waves that are breaking. And the back shore is that land area that we typically think of as the beach, the exposed sand or mud or whatever there. Zooming in a little more closely at the near shore zone, we can recognize three parts to it. The breaker zone is where waves are first beginning to break. Sometimes there is an underwater ridge, a bar there, as in this picture, but not always. Then we have the surf zone, where the waves continue to break and release their energy into other forms, including the sound that you hear and moving sand around, all that sort of stuff. And then again, the swash zone. This is the area that as waves go in and out, the part that's alternating between underwater and exposed. Another feature on here, berm is a relatively flat topped and somewhat steeper sided area above the normal high tide line that is found on relatively broad, undisturbed sandy beaches. And again, a longshore bar, a ridge of sand that is roughly parallel to the shore. Sand eroded off from the beach can create such a bar. There's the berm, there's the bar. Okay, so beach profile is the shape of the beach in cross-section. If you could dig a great big print through it, people trying to walk around the beach probably wouldn't be happy with you, but you could see the shape of the beach there. Of course, sand moves around pretty easily, and so the beach profile will change depending on patterns of weather and what the waves are doing. We can have a swell beach profile. This is what forms under calmer conditions when we have swell-style waves. And so that's the blue line here. We have a relatively smooth curve along here. The berm area, that flatter area above high tide, is relatively wide, and the beach face is somewhat steeper compared to the alternative, the storm profile. Again, you remember having storm versus swell waves. Swell is as the waves spread out from the fetch area. Faster ones are also similar in size, and end up together. Slower ones, likewise, similar in size, end up together. And so you get the relatively regular pattern of swell when you're away from the storm area where the waves are being generated by stirring up the ocean surface. Pictures of those waves again, we've got the storm versus the swell pattern. Under stormy conditions, the waves tend to be bigger and more irregular. That tends to be eroding sand off the beach. Our swells tend to carry sand from under the ocean and bring it back to the beach. So with erosion, we have less wide a berm. Some of that sand's washed down into the ocean. Correspondingly, the front of the berm is less steep as we've taken out part of it there. And that sand that's washed into the ocean can form bars out under the water. Eventually, things calm down, storm's gone, and we return to regular swells, which gradually tend to bring that sand back to the beach once more. So over time, bar will move from deeper in closer, and eventually that sand gets back to the beach. Assuming that we have a reasonable amount of period of the swell conditions between storms. Now, some sand's washing in, some washes out. We've also got wind blowing things around. What's the balance? We can calculate a sand budget. How much sediment is washing up, being added to the beach? How much is eroding, washing away somewhere else? So we have longshore currents that are coming into our particular bit of beach, carrying sand along with them, and currents going out, carrying sand along with them. Do we have any rivers that are carrying sand in? Are there cliffs eroding that contribute? Do we have swell waves washing sand up from the ocean? Or do we have storm waves washing things away? Do we have wind blowing sand off the beach into dunes? Add all these up and we can figure out what's the pattern of sand. Are we gaining, losing, staying steady? The textbook gives an example where it adds up to a total of a loss of 10,000 cubic meters per year. Don't know for sure, but I imagine certainly my budget would not do well with a loss of 10,000 per year. So this doesn't sound like a great long-term situation for the beach. Behind a sandy beach, we often have sand dunes. Winds blowing sand from the dry upper part of the beach create these dunes. And they'll tend to have a kind of wavy sinusoidal profile. The first dune closest to the ocean is the primary dune. Sometimes there are additional secondary dunes beyond that. We have some specialized, rather small plants characteristic of the primary dune ridge. And then we tend to have somewhat bigger and more variety of things on the secondary ridge into the back dune area. Why would that first dune not have many types of plants growing there? What could be difficult? Well, for one thing, you got the ocean right there. You're the first thing sticking up above sea level, so wind is really hitting into you. And besides just tolerating the wind not getting blown away, that wind is carrying a fair amount of salt spray. So those plants have to be tolerant of a good deal of salt. Another challenge, pile of sand. If you pour water on it, it sinks right in. it is not holding water very well at all. So it's a relatively dry habitat. In fact, you sometimes find cactus there. There's one type of cactus that you find on the dune areas southeastern US that is popularly known as the jumping cactus. Now, of course, cactus can't actually jump, but it seems like it because you may find this bit of cactus sticking way up on the side of your leg. How to get there? All the cactus plants I see are much shorter than that. Oh, it must have jumped. Well, no, it didn't actually jump. What happens is pieces do break off it pretty easily. And so if you catch a little bit as you walk past on one leg and don't notice it, the next step you take may catch it off of that leg a little higher up on the other. And so it can kind of work its way up until it's noticeably higher than you expect. As you get further back, things are a little more sheltered. So that helps more types of plants to grow. And as they grow, they contribute some additional nutrients and water trapping ability to the soils that helps promote other things growing, and gradually get a more diverse set of things growing. In this case, it's an island, so towards the middle of our island there. Having plants on the dunes helps hold the dunes there. As wind blows, sand tends to get trapped among the plants and their roots. And so having the plants growing nicely there promotes dunes getting bigger and being more stable. If we have a gap that's a spare sand, it's very easy for wind to blow that away. Waves, if they get up there in a storm, to wash stuff away. And in turn, dunes don't just provide protection for plants behind them, but also any houses behind them. Take away the dune, you don't have that protection. But this is a random clip photo I happen to find online, so I have no idea where this is happening. But this is not such a good idea. This will tend to damage the dune vegetation and make the dunes easy to erode, make it easier then for storms to get at things behind the dunes, like people's houses. To make nice big dunes, well, no surprise, you need lots of sand. Make a pile of sand. Having winds blowing from the ocean towards the land pretty consistently and reasonably strong. I mean, sand is bigger than silt and clay, so it does take a little more wind to move it around. A wide range between high and low tide. Why that is important? That's not too easy in general to be living someplace that's alternating between being flooded and exposed and flooded and exposed. So there's often a large bare area where the tide is alternating in and out, and bare areas that's more exposed dry sand that can blow around and make the dunes. Similarly, having a relatively wide beach with a fairly gentle slope, good for the wind to blow along, pick up that sand, lots of sand, and build up the dunes. Wind, air doesn't hold stuff up too well. Things tend to fall pretty easily. So, not surprisingly, even something small as sand typically isn't carried that far by the wind. Instead, you tend to have a kind of sort of bouncing, saltatory technical term there, which just means jumping. And it goes up the dune. There's our mouse. There we go. So bouncing along here and then over the crest and down it goes there. And so over time, dunes tend to move around, especially if you don't have plants growing to tend to hold them in place. If we have wave erosion, that will wash the sand away and cut off the front of the dune, making a steep scarp. Dunes provide useful protection, help to prevent flooding coming in during storms, especially with plants growing on them. If we damage the plants or bulldoze the dune out of the way entirely, just make a shortcut to the beach. That's also a shortcut from the beach for the storm waves. If we protect things, like often you'll see a boardwalk like this one to help guide people to walk on the boardwalk, not all over the place in the dunes, then that's a good way of allowing beach access while keeping the dunes stable and providing some better protection. I'm seeing the version of this PowerPoint it does, not the most edited one. Here's an example where we have dunes that have been severely damaged by a storm. Caption says Pea Island, South Carolina. There's Major Pea Island, North Carolina. You can see that there's a big gap where dunes have been washed away, major damage there. You also notice a lot of dark sand here. Now, part of that could be from eroding the highway, but also beach sand around here tends to have this very light brown sandy color to it. Most of that, as you may have seen with the lab on sediment, is little clear pieces, worn down bits of quartz, but there are the occasional darker specks in there, which are various other, not as common as quartz, but similar, the hard and long-lasting minerals that accumulate there. Those tend to be somewhat denser than quartz, and so in the storm, as the quartz sand gets blown or washed away, you often have some of the concentration of the darker minerals left behind. So if you dig a hole in the beach, you may see this dark layer that reflects a storm. Here's an example of impact of storm causing damage. This is along the coast in Oregon. You can see some dunes here, and then you start to run into the houses there. And then we had a very stormy winter affected by an El Nino system, and much of those protective dunes are gone. So these houses are going to be quite vulnerable now to flooding. Some coasts, such as here in much of the southeastern US, have barrier islands along them. And these are basically large piles of sand and mud, roughly parallel to the coast. No surprise, big piles of sand, so it's places where there is a lot of sand around. Also, typically it's someplace where the bottom of the ocean is sloping very gently as you go further out. If you're someplace with a very narrow continental shelf, then pretty quickly it drops off as the slope. That sand's going to be washed out and down and gone rather quickly. But a relatively flat, very broad continental shelf gives an opportunity for the sand to accumulate and give us the barrier islands. And being an island, there's a gap between it and the land, and so you have lagoons and estuaries between the island and the mainland. The lagoons and estuaries will be connecting out to the ocean through a series of tidal inlets. Here's a view of part of a barrier island, and then south of there, you can barely see under all the hotels, Myrtle Beach. Here's an aerial view of a well-developed barrier island. This is Hatteras Island here in North Carolina. So you see the beach zone, and then dunes. There's a flatter area where the houses are concentrated. And then gradually it gets lower and we extend out into these marshes and mud flats, and then the sound area, the lagoon behind. So diagram, here's a typical setup of a barrier island. Out to the right in this picture is the ocean. And then we have the beach. There's the berm along there. A series of dunes. This one's had some storms. We have an overwash fan where storm waves have washed through the dunes and carried some sand out into the area beyond. Back part of the island tends to be relatively flat, may have some forest or grassy areas depending. And then as it gradually gets lower down, we get the salt marsh, high and low marsh areas, and then sand or mud flat and the lagoon. This diagram also shows layers underneath. And what we see in this case is that mud, like what's found in the marsh, is extending underneath the island as we go somewhat deeper down. So what's now the beach here has mud under it, showing that once was marsh. We've had some change in the island here. We may not think as much about moving islands, so here's a different example. From this picture, what can you tell about which way the football has moved during the game here? Well, you don't start the game with a football in the end zone. So the ball was somewhere closer to the middle of the field. Now, of course, in the way football games go, it probably went back and forth a lot. But overall, the result has been for the ball to move this way and Gardner-Webb getting a touchdown. So we can tell that things have moved because they're not where they started out. Similarly, a beach like this one happens to be in Georgia. We've got all these dead trees out on the beach. Pine trees don't grow in the beach. They grow out in the middle of the island. What was the middle is now the beach. This is telling us that island's moving away from the ocean back towards the land over time. How do you make a barrier island? There are several different possibilities. If we have a ridge of sand up on land, and then sea level rises, or the land sinks, then that form a ridge and get surrounded by water and become an island or series of islands. Or we could build up sand, forming kind of a peninsula off of the land, a sand spit. But again, sand's easy to move around. And so potentially we could have waves, likely a storm, that wash through, cut it off. Or maybe if we have a longshore bar out under the ocean that's there long enough, maybe it builds up to the point of emerging out of the water. Diagram versions of each of those. Again, if we have lower sea level, like say during glacial times, ice age, lots of water's stuck in a glacier, not in the ocean, so sea level is low. And we might build a ridge of dunes at that time. Then as sea level rises back, that old dune ridge will become the barrier island. Here's an example of a sand spit forming. Longshore drift is washing the sand along this way, and then there's a bend in the land. So we start to get this peninsula of sand sticking out. Eventually, as waves wash through, now we've got an island beyond that spit of sand, or buildup of a longshore bar. Moving sea level, sand moves around. Say if sea level is rising, there's going to be more waves, especially during storms, that are able to wash that sand and move it away from the ocean back towards the land. So barrier islands will tend to move towards the land through time if sea level is rising. Sea level retreating, we can have sand building up the other way over time. Sea level has been rising since the last big melting of glaciers in the ice ages. It slowed down around 5,000 years ago, but still rising more slowly. These days, thanks to global warming, it's rising faster again, not quite as fast as it was, say, 6,000 years ago, but faster than it was 100 years ago. When we have a series of barrier islands, there are gaps between them, else it wouldn't be an island. And these are often referred to as tidal inlets because tide will come in and out through here, washing sand in, washing it out, back and forth. High tide, low tide, currents reversing through here. But also, longshore currents are moving things sideways. And so over time, where we have these inlets can close off, or maybe a new inlet is open through what was the middle of an island. These change around. Again, not a great option for trying to build something more permanent. As the currents of the longshore currents are flowing along, carrying sand, we get to an inlet. Okay, then that's running into the tide currents coming in and out here. As tide goes in, flood tide, that'll carry sand on into the lagoon or bay area behind. As the tide goes out, the ebbing tide carries sand, and you have a pile of sand out into the ocean. Right in that narrow inlet, we can have relatively fast currents as tide is changing, the not slack tide, high or low tide, but in between. And so move the sand and then piles up out here. This was something that some of the European explorers coming to this part of the world learned the hard way. A number of the European coasts are a little bit more rocky than what we tend to see here, so they weren't as familiar with a coast that was kind of all sand. Hey, there's a gap between two bits of land that looks like it would be a nice harbor to sail into. Well, if you try to sail right in the middle there, you're running into the sand delta and may run aground. You actually do a bit better for deeper water if you go for the side of the inlet there. Here's an example of inlets moving over time. We're kind of building out a spit here and piling up some more sand. And then probably during a storm, waves wash through, and now we've got a gap here. We've created an island out of part of the spit. But over time, longshore current will move sand along, moving it into one side of the spit and eroding from the other. And so these tidal inlets tend to move around over time. Again, storm surge, we know this with waves and storms. As wind is blowing in a storm, it's pushing water ahead of it, plus lower pressure allows the water to push up somewhat more. And so we have effectively raising the ocean level. And as the storm with its waves comes in, it's higher than normal as its baseline. And of course, then we got the tides going on top of that as well. So because of storm surge, we can have waves going in much further than would be normally the case. and much easier to potentially erode through dune areas and make a new channel. Here's an example. This is a photo of a barrier island area, and we see these big patches of sand where sand from the beach and dunes has been washed by big waves out into the marsh area. Now, if it's just marsh there, hey, there's some sand in the marsh. Over time, marsh will grow back, winds will rebuild the dunes. It might be a little bit different place, but if it's a natural area, hey, things move around some, not a problem. If somebody's house were there, that would be a big problem. Trying to build something that we expect to be permanent in these changing places again doesn't work so well. Here's an example of a channel, tidal inlet, formed due to storm. You can see where maybe part of a bridge or pier or something is broken off in the foreground and sand is eroding. You see the steep edges. That's going to be washing away pretty quickly. Out here, somebody's dumped a bunch of rocks out in the channel trying to control erosion. Will it help or not? Well, we'll see. Here's another example. Storm waves have eroded the dunes if the developer didn't bulldoze them away in the first place. And this stairway down definitely is not in good shape, appropriately blocked off, but I wouldn't care to be owning these as a long-term investment. Before too long, it looks like these buildings are going to follow the way of the stair and be falling down onto the beach. Here's another example. This road has been undercut and pieces of it falling down as waves came in from a storm. You'll notice that actually there's a little more sand out here, and then it looks almost like a ditch formed by the erosion right along the road. What's happened there? Well, the road being relatively hard, as a wave comes in, it hits that hard road, bounces back, and erodes more due to that extra bounce. So actually putting something hard there can promote more erosion from waves bouncing off of it. Okay, so beach, barrier islands, sandy areas, sand moving around, not too stable long term. What about an ocean cliff? A sea cliff? Well, those are erode too. Especially right at the bottom where it's contacting the ocean. Waves come in, of course, they're pounding on there all the time, but also as the wave splashes up, air that's trapped between the wave and the cliff gets shoved down into cracks, put under pressure. The wave drains away, that air can expand again. But it's pushed in the crack, so it's going to tend to push that crack wider. Likewise, waves will be carrying sand and mud and rock and whacking that on the cliff. Some rocks will actually tend to dissolve and break down with the exposure to the salt water. As water gets in, evaporates, the salt crystals growing, those can help push cracks open, as well as chemically can be hard on the rock. There are some types of ocean life that will make holes in rocks. So all of these forces are tending to help eat away at a cliff. Over time, it's eroding back. Eventually, the cliff can become unstable and a chunk will fall down. Well, now we've got a pile of stuff that's kind of protecting the bottom of the cliff until that erodes away once more, and now the waves are back pounding on the cliff again. This also definitely highlights that getting too close to the edge of one of these cliffs is not a good idea. You can also see, besides the pile of stuff that's already fallen, a spot where the bottom of the cliff has been undercut by waves. Definitely anything out at the tip here is likely to fall before long. How fast is a cliff going to erode? Well, no surprise. What's it made of? Does it have particular weaknesses? Any sort of cracking in it? Rock joints or faults or things of that sort? Rainfall pattern. If you've ever tried building sandcastles at the ocean, you know on the one hand that you don't want totally dry sand that doesn't hold together at all, but also highly soggy sand won't hold its shape well. You want a little bit damp to hold together and stick, but not too damp. Also, water, it's a good deal heavier than air. So if we have lots of water added to the cliff, that makes it heavier, helps it fall down. So very rainy, that's not good for our cliff sticking around very well. A little bit of water helps stick things together. If it's more sandy, totally dry, you might have some issues with that as well. Of course, how steep is the cliff? What our waves are like? All these help determine how fast it's going to erode away. So there are lots of different processes all going on that will be helping eat away at our cliff. But once we get a little below the water surface, down there, things are much less hard on the cliff than right at the top. So we tend to get a relatively flat surface building up out under the ocean in front of our eroding cliff. So again, this is known as a wave cut platform. You can see in the diagram here. Many places with more cliff type coasts, such as the west coast of the Americas, you often see a series of these platforms. So up at the top of the picture, we see a relatively flat looking area, then steeper, then another flatter area where the road's going along, then another cliff. And then out here, you can kind of see between the lighter color of the water and the occasional rock sticking up that we have a current day flatter shelf area extending in front of the cliff. So it looks like we have an old sea cliff up here, and then the flatter area in front of that, the modern sea cliff, flatter area in front of that, things getting lifted up. Why would that happen? Well, this goes back to plate tectonics. If we're in a collision zone, we've got the ocean plate pushing under the land, and from time to time we get a big earthquake, and we shove the overlying land up as ocean plate pushes under. So this is recording a series of earthquakes over time that have pushed the land up and left these cliffs. Here's another view, similar coastal area. You can see the waves telling us that the water's pretty shallow in front of the modern cliff, and then another flat area, and then going up once more further. Here's an example, cliffs relatively sandy, and then houses built right on top. Not such a good idea. And to make things even more impressive, we're seeing erosion of the cliff by our house. That doesn't look good. What do? So the bright idea was to build a great big wall on top of the edge of the cliff. A big, heavy wall. Yeah. They build it, and it proceeds to fall down, taking a big chunk of the cliff with it. And now the houses are closer to the edge of the cliff. Not a good plan. Here's another view showing how close the erosion is coming to those houses. Not something I'd want as a long-term investment. From cliffs, we can go to deltas. A delta is where we have a river flowing into the ocean or a lake or other water body. And the river washing across the land is picking up sediment, carried along, dumps it out as the water flows going into our ocean or lake. They tend to often be somewhat triangular, and so named for the Greek letter. The delta plain is the relatively flat, low-lying area of land. And then we have delta front sloping down and pro-delta out beyond. And corresponding, we have different layers of sand and mud underneath there. Over time, mud's washing down, piling up, and so the delta builds its way out into the ocean. But it's also affected by the patterns of tides and waves, river flow. If we have less sand and mud washing down, say people have helpfully built dams all over the place that trap the sand and mud somewhere further upstream, then the delta is going to be getting to erode rather than build up. Another thing, when the river first dumps that sand and mud, it's pretty jumbled up. But over time, they've got time to jiggle around and settle down. Yep, that's not showing up here. Settle down much more flat and regular. So over time, a delta that's not getting much new sediment tends to sink. Kind of like the label you see on a bag of chips or cereal box, something like that. Settlement may have occurred in shipping. You opened up and, hey, looks like I only got half a box. Well, when they dumped it in at the factory, the pieces were all jumbled around and took up more space, but over time, as it's been shipped, they've had time to jiggle into place and settle down. That's why it's based on the weight, not the volume for selling those types of things. Same sort of things happening with the sand and mud in the delta. Different patterns of shapes of delta. The classic triangular delta pattern tends to be in places where there's not too much tide influence and the river flow is not as strong. If we have relatively strong tides, we can get a more network of channels, not so triangular shape. This is common for deltas here on east coast of North America, for example, among others. If we have an area where it's flowing to that doesn't have as strong tides or waves, then it may be the river flow that dominates the shape, although in this picture, another important thing about the shape is that they got the picture backwards. People often like to live and build in coastal areas, but dynamic, they're changing. We try to build something and the coast changes and we got problems. So a common response is to try to do something to hold that coast in place. Perhaps trying to block sand, keep it from being moved around so much. Perhaps interfere with the waves, decrease the wave energy. Putting something on the beach, maybe more sand or rocks, things of that sort. Also, there's the past laws to say, ignore the scientific evidence, pretend it's not happening. Yes, that has happened in the state that we are in at the moment. But as it turns out, all these approaches tend to run into problems. That's probably a good spot for stopping for now. So we will take up what happens when people try to change what the beach is doing next time.